Malika, you're a little soft. You may want to just come a little closer to your mic.
In my ear.
Ah, this is perfect.
Hi. On behalf of our team, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you to the fifth day of the Kurula Varki Design Forum 2020. My name is Malika, and I will be your host for the evening along with Sanjana. Today, we present our second detox session.
Detox at KVDF include presentations and insightful dialogue with two exceptional experts from the field who share with us their personal journeys and experiences in the world of practice. Our first presenter for the evening is Sarosh Anklesaria. Sarosh Anklesaria is the T. David Fitzgibbon Professor of Architecture at Carnegie Mellon University. He's an architect, educator, and former critic at the Yale School of Architecture. In addition to teaching at Yale, he has taught architecture at the School of Architecture at Pavilion, Cornell University, the Pratt Institute, and many more. He runs an independent design and research practice and also has worked as an architect with Dillard Coffedio, Plus Rentro, Herzog de Muro, and B.V. Doshi. In the past, he co-founded Anthill Design with Riaz Sayyadji.
The second speaker of the evening, Dr. Gautam Bhan, holds a PhD in City and Regional Planning from the University of California, Berkeley. He is currently a part of the School of Human Development at IIHF Bangalore, where he teaches, researches, and writes on the politics of urban poverty and inequality, urban and planning theory, housing, and identity of social practice. A very warm welcome to both of you. The first half of today's session will be the two presentations by the panelists, followed by a conversation between them. Alongside this will be a question-answer round. All audience members are invited to ask questions in the Q&A tab of their Zoom windows. Upon selection of your question, we will prompt you to turn on your video. Sarosh, I invite you to present your screen.
Hi, does this work?
Yeah, we can see you. We can see your presentation.
And is the screen coming through?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you for the generous introductions, and I'm gonna get right into it because I have a fair bit to cover. As you can see, I clearly struggled with the title. But essentially, I'm going to talk about things that have preoccupied me, some of which are often referred to as problems that are canonical, problems that are disciplinary, problems that come from within the disciplines of architecture that we often, think are very much about our own profession and disciplines, and then things that are outside of the discipline. And very much architecture exists at the schism or at the divide between these things, that this is how we sort of theorize and practice. And one of the sort of conceits of my talk today is that we need to get rid of this schism and essentially create a much more synthetic way of connecting form, questions of tectonics and syntax with questions that are of the world at large, that are immersed in things related to either questions of sociology, environmentalism, ecology, or politics. And we have to operate across these divides of the disciplinary interior and the exterior. So my talk today is structured around a few themes that have preoccupied my professional and teaching career. The themes are fluid, discursive, evolving, and reference one or more projects. All of the built work that I'll be showing you today is through a collaborative effort with Riaz Tayabji and the firm Antil Design, which I co-founded with him and Roma Pandya. So if I say I always mean we when I'm referring to the built early built work. That's the initial part of the lecture. So the first theme it's hard to escape this notion of subtraction coming from very much a kind of primal act of architecture. And we find it across architectures of the Indian subcontinent, and we are very much sort of immersed in an understanding and appreciation of notions of carving. And also the fact that these are not just receptacles of water, the step wells, but also receptacles of life. And here I make a small digression. Speaking of life, I'm interested in these representations of life. This is a late 16th century manuscript of a Persian Ramayana owned by Hamida Banu Begum, the mother of Akbar. And I'm fascinated by the multiplicity of life, the synanthropism between reptiles, mammals, birds, fish, other critters, and humans, with a bit of architecture in the background. And I urge you also to think about it as what is the flatness of the painting doing? It kind of privileges, it accords the same level of importance both to the architecture and to the bird and to the critters and to everything else in the painting. And I find that this is very much of interest to me, this kind of ontological flatness of the subject. So very, very early project, which dealt with this notion of subtraction, a studio for an artist where we essentially carved the building and dug it into the ground. And with the earth that we got, we sort of piled it on one side. And we created this mound that you could sort of go right up to, and generated multiple different ways of traversing and arriving at the site. Because the building is oriented in a certain way, the sun sort of constantly registers itself across the project. And then the act of building it really shaped my early impressions as an architect. It was kind of very important, almost more than the design of the project, the kind of messy reality, dealing with the contractors working on site, seeing people working on site, seeing children on site. These were things that stayed with me for a very long time. They still stay with me and haunt me in good ways and bad. Another project that was in Udaipur on a barren site, that was about also carving and subtraction and sort of situating the building into the rock and making a form that also sort of relates and is sympathetic to the rocky landscape. And then here you sort of understand how the plan refers to volumes that are tucked in, but then open up views that are very deliberate and constructed. And you start also the act of building it was very essential in understanding this building. And I've always found these images fascinating of the labor that is embedded in architecture, especially when we work in our context. And I think that this labor needs to be acknowledged, needs to be sublimate, needs to be theorized, problematized, in a much more serious way than we do at the moment. Another thing is, of course, questions of frugality. We didn't have the means, resources, or the area to build a road. Road would have been incredibly expensive. So what we did was we created like this really ad hoc platform that comes from cheap mining equipment that allows us to, in addition to walking up the building, it allows us to sit or stand on this platform and access the building kind of ad hoc way. And here I come to the second theme, which is that of course, another very important aspect of our landscape, very seminal, the courtyard. And of course, also in reference to the Indian city. But here, we were interested in this idea that you can have a very open plan, but somehow you can still meander through the plan. You can still sort of find your way. So as you kind of walk up here, you run into blocks all the time. So for example, from the living room to this place, you have to sort of go around, but you're sort of circumambulating the courtyard. You reference another courtyard here. So although there is a lot of linearity in the plan, the movement across the building is not at all linear. You're sort of doing the pack donkey all the time. And this notion of the pack donkey is again, I guess, one of these Corbusian critiques that has never been enough appreciated, or that actually we celebrated instead of deriding it. So here again, as you see, you can see the courtyards through, but you have to sort of walk around it. Again, images of the project under construction, and a third building also with this kind of central courtyard space. But here we work with this kind of very gentle curved line that sets up a way of circulating through the building. So the kind of curves are really gentle, but they implicate you as you walk across the project. And here you kind of begin to sense this really gentle curve in the building and this kind of central courtyard space developing that opens up as you walk. It implicates time. So as you walk, it opens up certain views of the project. The roof is heavily insulated with these parts, and also a really fascinating sort of project to just witness. So before Ornament became crime, it went through the process of becoming extraneous. Alberti considered Ornament as a form of auxiliary light, a complement to beauty. Beauty was an inherent property suffused within the body, but Ornament was considered to be something that was extraneous, something that was attached. And of course, Lowe's ultimately calls it out to be a crime. But what if Ornament was always intrinsic and never extraneous, like in this Haveli, or always, again, not referring to this binary between function and ornament, but really part and parcel of the way in which we live, inhabit, and project ourselves onto the world at large. And I'm again fascinated by these synanthropic constructs, the Chabutra as a place for kind of non-human inhabitation, where ornament is completely intrinsic to the project. Or here, where I love the affect of this thing, where the form essentially pixelates at the Meenakshi temple at Madurai. And here you don't register any form at all. As you come closer, you have this kind of immersive pixelated experience, which is, again, quite visceral. We've honestly struggled to incorporate form in ornament enough in our projects, but this is something that I am very interested in pursuing. So what is agency and why no more schisms? Because I argue that agency is a core and exigent value within the discipline today. It is architecture's own transformative capacity to enact, affect, and inspire change, explored through a twofold aspect. First, one that directly acknowledges the claim that aesthetics themselves are fundamental and revolutionary, considering agency embedded within architecture's own disciplinary aesthetics, its formal, tectonic, spatial qualities, but also agency of the world at large, right? And so agency has only recently been theorized in this way through the work of Giddens, John Law, Latour, and others. And in the face of all pervasive ecological, political crisis, agency rescues architecture from its own inwardness and obsolescence through means, methods, manifestos, devices, and sites that embrace an architecture of engagement. And I argue that if we don't do this, we really become almost irrelevant as a profession. I took this photograph a while back, but it actually is a fiction. It is a stitch of two pictures, one of a project that is very much about architects working together to create housing in Lima. The other one, which is completely ad hoc, coming out of self-built architectures in Villa El Salvador. So on the left, you see all these, like some of the greatest architects of the time asked to build various prototypes for housing in Lima. And on the right, you see how this town, Villa El Salvador, was constructed. But visiting both these places in 2013 is remarkable how similar they are. And what is interesting is that the ordinary vernacular modes of construct have infiltrated also the designs of the architect. And I found this to be very inspiring. I thought that we have not really understood how to learn and build architecture as not an a priori construct, but essentially as process, as something that is built over a span of time and incremental. And as was said yesterday, not only rooted in economics, but rooted in all sorts of other practices of the city. And so one of the projects we had was for a pavilion that the client said, we really want this to be open-ended, it has to grow over time. And that sort of set this kind of strange superimposition of the vernacular city that grows over time with these rebars hanging up, and the Farnsworth House, which is this kind of perfect form that can never be violated. And we said, what if we mix these two things? What do we get? We started with this kind of very, very crisp, very formally driven pavilion, and we built it. But we left a few sort of open-ended signs, moments in it. And while we were building it, we had already decided that there were a whole range of architectural forms that one could work with, that this was only the first like stack of several sort of additional capacities of this project. And also within the first building itself, we said that there is various elements of the building obviously have different lifespans. And this is not, in a sense, different from Archigram's project of the plug-in city, where, of course, at a totally different scale, the conceit was that different elements of the building have different expendable time frames. So here is the project as it stands right now, but over time, one can imagine that it can really grow. And this, like I said, is only one avatar, one possible outcome of many, many different outcomes. A project in Malawi, which also deals with this notion of time and temporality. And I find this really fascinating. This is Malawi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And this is a photograph of their current school. The this is a failure of purely of architecture. So the building is so has such small windows that during the day, students actually have to sit outside the classroom. So this is a case where resources are horribly used, where, you know, in spite of the fact that a new building is built, it cannot be used because electricity is not existent. And so students cannot be inside during the day. And that's kind of what the landscape is like. This is the Benga parish. Of course, the parish is the place where all the money is, and they want to build an additional, a kind of extension of the school, a kind of high school. So we looked at this normative school type with these small openings, and we said, what if we flipped it to bring in sunlight and ventilation, harvest rainwater, break it to create a meeting space, extend the roofs for shade, and then attach it to ventilated pit latrines. We get a kind of much more enmeshed condition that still works with the local construct of materials. But now when you start implementing it on site, we introduce this idea of site and services, which has been theorized, and there's a huge kind of history to it, all the way from Latin America to the Aranya project by Doshi. And we said, but what if we took site and services, but we incorporated landscape as the fundamental kind of underpinning of it. And we said that we put in all the infrastructure and landscape needed. And here we worked with landscape architects that were working in the area, and also with this question of food, because food is fundamental to going to school in Malawi. Lots of students go to school because this is the place where nutrition is provided. And so we said, okay, the periphery will be an extension of the field. We will have these courtyards where certain kinds of trees will be planted, like fruit orchards. And then we will have these 3 large assembly areas, which will be super graphics derived from the Kitenge fabrics. And then we will have these kind of herb planters that will have much smaller, a much finer grain of plants. And then the buildings just happen at the end. You know, the buildings almost are the last comers to the site. They can be built incrementally over time, and you get something like this. So a whole range of tactics that work alongside such a project, and then mostly native food related landscapes that are almost fundamental to the building. So here you get these kind of herb-like. So the idea is very much that learning exists very much outside the classroom as much as it is inside, and in these courtyards. Which brings us to the question of food. So these are images from Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture, where I find this really fascinating that he was interested in architectures of food, but he was really interested in the machines, as the efficiencies of the machine age, and the pure forms that were implied in these machine efficiencies. And I was asking myself, if these were architectures of food, of grain storage and so on, industrial architectures of the time, what are these architectures today? And so this is some research that kind of starts with the Richard Rogers fellowship that I was up to last year. And so Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command tells us that the killing of hogs was semi-mechanized already in the late 19th century. But even until 1944, the image on the right, chicken were still killed manually, even in the production line, right? So this is 1944, and we see this kind of thing being driven into chicken. So this is a kind of manual process embedded within a machine age. But what happened then? So chicken in the 1920s was pound for pound as expensive as lobster, but by 1960s, it was so cheap that it had quickly become America's most popular meat. Almost all of the chicken we eat today is the direct progeny of the chicken of tomorrow contest, a 1948 contest to produce the most efficient chicken using generic techniques. It not only had to be an efficient chicken with large breasts, very large colored feathers, so that it can be plucked and it could stand industrial production without literally falling apart. But what's really interesting is that almost all the chicken we consume today comes from two types of chicken. Cobb 500, these things have like names. Cobb 500, which is one type owned by a giant food company called Tyson, and Ross 308 owned by Aviagen. And all the chicken that is chicken plants set up in India today use one or the other of these two roosters. So, you know, this has become now the production of chicken. It has from the pure aesthetics of the machine, the pure forms of the machine, we have literally given rise to the interiority of the machine now. And this interior attribute of the machine is totally unseen to most of us. So the modern broiler puts on weight, this chicken puts on weight 5 times than its avatar from the 50s. It grows, of course, much faster. It's a completely different engineered bird now. High doses of antibiotics allow for occupancies of 100,000 birds in a single farm, and highly mechanized systems of electrical stunning, slaughter, evisceration, cleaning, and chilling allow for thousands of chickens to be automatically processed in an hour. So now here comes the real machine, right? And these machinic architectures are the true enablers, I argue, of the Anthropocene. For the total mass of farmed chicken exceeds the biomass of all other birds on the planet. I mean, this is an unfathomable construct. So furthermore, the biomass of humans and their domesticated animals now outweighs that of all wild terrestrial vertebrates. Chicken consumption is growing faster than that of any other meat, with 23 billion chicken alive at any one time. Humans have engineered chicken as the most numerous vertebrate, a poignant symbol of the Anthropocene. The distinctive bones of chickens in all our sites, in all our landfills, will undoubtedly become the fossilized markers of the time when humans reigned the planet. So the fact that we think of this bird now as something that has become so ubiquitous that we have, yes, we have made it the most ubiquitous vertebrate of all time. So I want to read this out. Any intelligent species which arises in the far future, hyper-evolved rats or octopuses perhaps, will have a puzzle on their hands in trying to figure out how and why millions of these rapidly evolved bones lie mixed within the techno-fossil debris of the huge petrified dump sites we leave behind. As these future explorers reconstruct this bird, a creature far more helpless than the dodo, they may well rumble it too as a purely technological construct. But what about fish? So super trawlers. So so this idea that somehow we have now created machines that are planetary, that are operating at planetary scales, and another one of them is the super trawlers. So the super trawlers are behemoths of planetary fishing. These massive ocean fishing vessels embody the pinnacle of design proficiency, and they can vacuum entire shoals of fish, and they again operate at planetary scales with GPS tracking systems to track fish migrations, integrated fish finders to locate fish using sonar, and so on and so forth. And I want you to appreciate the scale of this net. There's something like several of these Airbus A380s, you can imagine how many of them can fit within just one net of these super trawlers. But there's also surveillance, and this website allows us to now track, we can now track the location of every single fishing trawler beyond a certain size on the planet. This is just the extent of fishing around Sri Lanka and Indonesia. But one understands this kind of idea of the planet as being now a purely or a very, very heavily anthropological construct. The same with space debris, just in a span of half a lifetime for a planet that is 4.5 billion years old, we now have 900,000 pieces of space debris that are between 1 and 10 centimeters. It's hard to descend from a planetary orbit down into Earth without hitting one of these things now. Or the way in which the Earth has been, the soils have been planted. It would be easier to feed the planet if more crops ended up in human stomachs. But if you look at all of the purple part of this slide, you appreciate how much of it actually doesn't end up in human stomachs. It's used for feed and fuel. So I was looking at London as a site, and I was incredibly taken to just understand how much food London consumes from across the world. So top food imports to the UK from every country in the world. Or the efficiencies by which food is produced, or the lack thereof. Beef, for example, for every literally has just a 3% efficiency. I'm going to speed up here because I'm already out of time. But there are also counter movements that are equally radical or equally interesting. For example, here, an underground war, Second World War bunker that is now being converted into a place where food is produced with almost a near zero carbon footprint. It needs no heating or air cooling because it exists at such a depth. And a lot of these are reused carpets that become the beds for growing plants. I went and tasted some of this food, and it's actually quite delicious. This is this similar concept where food is produced really locally, and both the eating and the production of food occurs in this market that is itinerant, which means that the market is occupying parking sites and is used as a way of making these parking sites, rejuvenating these parking sites as it literally as a building that moves across sites. So with this in mind, I thought of just as a provocation, the market Symbiom as a localized post-pandemic experiment also in London as a potential site. This is not really a design, but more of a provocation. And what if we thought of the market Symbiom as a localized post-pandemic experiment that connects places of growing, preparation, storage, selling of food through a novel alliance of citizen farmers, scientists, ecologists, consumers, immigrants, but also birds, bees, bats, butterflies, critters, bacteria, viruses, and so on. At once a hybrid building, network, landscape, and territory. Unused and volunteered parcels of land, urban, peri-urban, and suburban, building terraces, parts of building facades, defunct parking lots, all of these things kind of produce this market Symbiom. And it is a Symbiom because it is an eco-restorative network of pollinator corridors, foraging landscapes, and bioswales produced through myriad acts of symbiosis. And it has its own microclimate, of course, because of the the ways in which it is produced. But it is also a market. It includes the quotidian places of the city. It's covered street markets, temporary and pop-up markets, food kiosks, community kitchens, cooperative farms. It is collectively owned and administered by citizens and non-humans through acts of commoning. Of course, markets are the original places, incubators of small businesses in an otherwise rapidly gentrifying global city. Far from a nostalgia for nature, the market Symbiom is a hybrid post-human practice, tactical in its appropriation of underutilized buildings. It operates over and underground using decommissioned subway tunnels, air raid bunkers, and so on. Another quick project that dealt with food, this time a student project that I was teaching at Taliesin. This is a golf course that is struggling in Phoenix, a desert, kind of a terrible place to have a golf course, but also part of the typology of Phoenix, where golf courses are the anchors for a lot of these housing sites, and utterly and completely unsustainable. So what if we did a takeover of the golf course, which again, over a period of time, through mulching and through mycelium, becomes a kind of a landfill, but a different sort of landfill, where building waste is first sorted and then repurposed to allow for a foraging landscape, a landscape where you could sort of walk through and pick food, but also a landscape for pollinators. Or in this project, a kind of strange alliance between algae and beer brewing, because they make for good symbiotic constructs, where actually one generates a very different aesthetic because of the logics by which algae need this kind of fuzzy, hairy facade. Or this project in Ornament, where we looked at the line of Goodwill as a place for intensification of densities. And then these facades can, especially those facades that face the south, can pick up a kind of planting landscape. But then there's also the interior, which is one of hybrid spaces where communal kitchens intersect with auditoriums, pickling with game rooms, greenhouses with bathhouses, to produce a kind of internal commons of this housing complex. And then speaking of commoning, there's another project, which also in Auroville, a student project, where we said, what if everything was shared and one just had to pick and almost like order things that one would use and share across a kind of infrastructure that the building provided. And this brings me to the last project. Thank you for bearing with me. I am almost, or I'm close to done. So this notion of temporality also intersects very heavily with the idea of practices. Again, very much verb. And this is, of course, an early plan for Sanskar Kendra. You can see Sanskar Kendra is actually dislocated here, the museum in Ahmedabad. But what I find interesting about this drawing is that if you read these things, Corbusier here actually alludes to various practices of crafts and art that would create a campus-like precinct. Of course, this never happened, and only the Sanskar Kendra and later Tagore Hall were built. But we took this as a point of departure for a studio, and we said, what if we investigated these various practices and created a cabinet of wonders that was kind of simultaneously operated at various scales? This is a small project, but a small little model, but one can interpret it as affecting various scalar attributes of the city, its practices that are embedded in this kind of cabinet of miracles. So the cabinet can kind of open up and these practices are enacted. So here a project that produces a school for various artisans or carpentry workshops and so on. But again, something where these are just instigators and borrowing from Sterling's project for Previ Lima, one can see that this project doesn't have a single party, but it can occupy and have many multiple constructs. Many possible futures are permitted or possible. And here, another project that on the same site that really teases out this notion of the earth and the terrestrial. And again, this wall as something that is a kind of anchor where multiple kinds of activities occur along and inside these walls. But of course, Corbusier's museum was rooted in the mundaneum, in Paul Otlet's proto ideas for the internet. But this is on the side, but this is really a fascinating idea of a proto-internet, literally from 120 years ago. And Corbusier finally works with Otlet to produce departures from the mundaneum, which become the endless museum. This endless museum was also supposed to grow, but I argue that it did not problematize questions of labor enough. Although Corbusier did say that there should be a mason and a carpenter who lives on the site permanently to build this thing ad nauseum. So eventually, the ideal form of the museum, which is a huge crisis in modernism, because museums were, of course, like the Louvre, they were royal artifacts, and modernism rejected that. And Corbusier's entire life was, in some sense, his career was devoted to finding the ideal form for the museum. He manages to build 3 buildings. They are exactly the same plans. They have the same pilotis. They have the same sort of spiral, swastika-like configuration of the plan. But one of them in Tokyo gets declared a World Heritage Site. The other one in Ahmedabad faces multiple problems, even that of demolition. And this idea of connecting these 3 buildings, because they're rooted in very much the same questions of the museum, the question of what should a modern museum be like, or a modernist, early modernist museum be like, led me to propose, again, a kind of as a provocation, a project that would be built and unbuilt. The fact that these museums relate more to one another than to their local constructs becomes a point of departure for a proposal that seeks to rejuvenate these sites and revive interest in their collective histories as a means of both critiquing and preserving their modernist legacies. So the project proposes an itinerant pavilion that will serve as a temporary attachment to each of the museums. The pavilion will literally be transported across the 3 museum sites and be reassembled each time in a ritual of making and unmaking, evoking a formative agenda of the endless museum. But in doing so, it will stimulate their futures to projective, open-ended possibilities through rotating exhibitions, installations, and stage events, a kind of unraveling of the museum. Through its itinerant condition, the pavilion will serve as an agent provocateur, activating key constituents, local stakeholders, and diverse publics. Of course, this idea of temporal construction is not new to Japan. The Itse shrine is relocated every 20 years. The Kumbh Mela in India is, of course, a famous example, but there are so many others of temporal activities. Even in modernism, even within Corbusier's oeuvre, the idea of temporal construction, of building and unbuilding, has been around for a long time. But what I'm interested in is through the act of unraveling, through the act of this temporal construction, other histories are actually talked about. This is the work of Ratna Fabri, one of India's first museologists, relatively unknown, but these are her interiors for the Chandigarh Museum. So, or the incredible story of the ceramic collection, because the collections of these museums grew, the museums themselves did not. And so the idea is that these unknown stories or lesser known stories would be unraveled in this process of the pavilion moving across site. So you get a frame, you get a few sort of toys or devices, as I call them, And then these devices are based on local constructs. To the right here, the frame is based on questions of proportions derived from the modular and from the golden ratio. And so one starts intersecting these devices with the frame, and one starts working with material and also projecting it as as a kind of problematic, as a sort of idea to be celebrated, the labor within it to be celebrated, as this pavilion moves between Tokyo, here Ahmedabad, Tokyo, and Chandigarh. This is the site in Chandigarh where you see it as a kind of multiple iterations of it located at the same time. And another moment of it also here in Chandigarh. Thank you very much. And I hope that wasn't too over time. I tried to.
Thank you, Sarosh, for your.
Yeah, I'm only reading your comment now that I didn't have to rush it, but I very much want that we have a conversation with Gautam, so I do not want to consume all the time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarosh, for your insightful presentation. Now I would like to invite Gautam sir to present his screen.
Okay, let me do this. Okay, so Sanjana, you can see the screen, okay?
Yes, I can see the screen.
So I really enjoyed that, and I was sort of very taken in also by the kind of the kind of visual narrative that one gets to read when one thinks of spatiality in this way. So mine's going to end up working very differently. And I think that's a really useful way to do it, to curate our conversations together. So I'm not an architect. And so I was thinking about what is the best way for me to present some provocations to you from my own practices. And I thought that the way I would do it was to borrow from some of my own disciplinary trainings. So I was trained within urban studies and anthropology. And in one way, what I'm attempting is a kind of autoethnography of practice, to think of a little bit of a different archive on how one approaches, in some ways, very similar questions of how one organizes one's life, one's practice. How do you know what to do? How do you decide what to do? How do you end up doing certain things? So the organizing logic of a lot of my work isn't the site or a sort of material built form. The organizing logic around my work is questions. It's the way I organize a lot of my practice. And I see my practice as being rooted around many ways of chasing certain kinds of questions that in them have certain visions of what I want the world to be, and the kind of world I want to live in, and the kind of part of what part I want to play in the creation of that world. So one of the ways I've organized this is that I wanted to take you different modes of practice. And when I use this word mode, I think that I'm pulling us back a little bit from the project to the practice, and to sort of say that there are things that motivate us and ways in which we work that at different times in our lives and our careers actually draw upon very different kinds of training, including the core training that many of you have as architects. But it is only one of the trainings that you will get in your life. And so what does one think in terms of different kinds of modes that are motivated and anchored in the end, not just by outcomes and impacts, but actually for me, very primarily by questions. And so I kind of want to share with you the kind of questions that preoccupy me. And I think where the overlap with Sarosh is really nice, and in this forum I think is useful, is I'm emphasizing some of those questions that I think through, which are deeply spatially rooted, that are actually also very fundamentally asking questions about the urban, about spatial practices, about spatial forms. So let me take you through some of them. So one of the core modes of my practice is research. So if the core verb that defines a lot of architectural practice is to design and to build, one of the core verbs that define my practice is to research, is to relate in some ways, to think about a relationship to the production of knowledge, and to think about what that knowledge is about. So in my early 20s in Delhi, one of the most formative experiences that that shaped the kind of work that I did was that in many of the low-income communities that I worked in, and that was just trying to understand, there were many questions of evictions. There were violent, bulldozer-led, state-sanctioned acts that erased and wiped out many kinds of communities that I had just begun to understand. And so in many ways, some of my first questions were about evictions. They were about, the most immediate question was not sophisticated. I simply had an urge on saying, how do you fight evictions? How do you become part of fighting the destruction of people's homes that were long built? Over time, one of the kinds of questions that I also found myself asking were, what do they tell us? And I began to sort of think a little bit also, not just about the eviction as an isolated act, but the eviction as a kind of symptom, as a kind of site that allows you to ask certain kinds of questions. Many of those evictions at that time were happening in Delhi due to court orders, and there were court orders in public interest litigations, in PILs. And so it kept haunting me that the idea that the eviction of the homes of the poor would be considered public interest. And the question that came to me at that point then was, if an eviction can result from a public interest litigation, what is this public? What is the notion of public interest here? In whose name is this public being defended? Who is being defended when this public interest is being enacted through the performance of an eviction? A second set of questions that I've thought through for a long time then has been to move then to the core idea we were trying to protect in the eviction, which was housing. I talked a little bit about this yesterday, but I think for me, one of the big moves in my life has been to think a little bit about the distinction between housing and houses. This distinction that the housing cannot be reduced to the unit. And so for me to think about housing as process, as time, as life, because the narrative, that the story that is told in the eviction is not that they broke my house, it is that they broke my life. And that move from the eviction as an act that doesn't destroy a built environment, but that destroys layers of time, that destroys investment and emotion and belonging and feeling. What does that tell us about something called housing that is definitely process and time and life, because also of the specific nature of that built environment, that it was built in a certain way, right? I moved from house to house where all the walls were complete and water came from taps. Most people around me did not move into a house where the walls were complete. They completed the walls while they lived within them, right? What Sarosh talked about is self-built housing when he talked about Lima. And to me, that tension of thinking about housing as something that was process and time and life, but was also deeply material, spatial, and legal and financial, right? The eviction was a landscape in tension with formal logics of property rights. It was a landscape in tension with formal norms of good materials and DCRs and planning norms and minimal distances. It was a financial landscape of investment, irreducible to real estate, but definitely still economic, definitely still about capital. So I kept thinking, for me, the question is, what else is the space always? My practice has always been to layer space with its other questions and thoughts, right? Sorry, I live in a collective home, so the home is going to be part of this presentation. The third part about then, I started thinking about questions of saying, what does one do before the eviction? How does one create a housing landscape, a set of practices that then are not about preventing eviction, but never getting to the point where one has to fight that fight? And for me, the object of policy and housing policy became the next place where my questions led. And the question I was asking there was, in some sense, what can the state do? But equally, because the auto-constructed self-built landscapes had made me never think of the state as the person who built the basti, I never thought of it as the only person who could protect it or generate it. So when you come from the question of eviction to the question of policy, you're not asking what's the right policy. What can the policy do? You're not assuming an easy notion of the state being both correct and both powerful. You're actually saying, what all should the state not do? Where all should I stop the state? How does the state relate to a process that it was never part of generating, that happened despite it, not without it knowing, right? The informal is not a separate vacuum planet outside state action, but what shouldn't the state do? And I frame this for you this way because I think it's very interesting to come at a question of policy by asking what should the policy not do, as opposed to saying what can the policy do. And we were talking yesterday about certainty and solution and the need to act. And for me, one way to accept the imperative to act, but at the same time, refuse yourself a sense of certainty and authority, is to ask constantly about the limits of state action as a question that helps you constantly challenge everything that you're proposing. A lot of, over time, what I realized was that one of the things that both in evictions and in policy and in thinking about housing's other layers and the other layers of space, that the questions that I was really searching for were more structurally fundamental about inequality. And for me, inequality did two things. One, it forced me to think at different scales. And the second is that it forced me to focus on the question of saying, how is it that inequality reproduces? How is it that a generation inherits not the gains of their parents' labor, but equivalent vulnerability to them? And the question of how inequality reproduces reframed my questions at evictions, because I realized I was studying evictions not just because they were acts of violence. I was studying them. To me, they were central ways in which urban inequality reproduces itself, where a life built back up is torn back down. Right? And then the next move that sort of came to me, by the time I got to my doctoral work, and later I was in a context where questions of urban theory were being challenged, where the models of New York, London, and Paris, Tokyo were being challenged, the models of the new exemplar cities of Shanghai, Singapore, and Dubai were being questioned. And in many ways, Southern urban theory, this idea to say, our ideas come from places that are nothing like us. I was at Berkeley doing a PhD, and I kept being taught things, and I kept saying, but this doesn't help me understand what I see in places that I know. And the question then of the canonical, of the central questions of how one picks up and builds new theory that comes from place, became this project of Southern urban theory, which is saying, what does it mean to learn from Lagos and Cairo and Johannesburg and Manila and Delhi and Mumbai? What does theory generate from here? One of my professors used to say, from New York, you theorize. From New Delhi, we give testimony. We are always case studies. We are always applications. We never generate knowledge from here that applies elsewhere. And there are a whole set of stories to be told about why this is, which is equally about the political economy of knowledge production and the power of the university, as it is about layers of inequality and privilege. So you see how these questions begin to meld into each other and move across scale. So in some way, the way Sarosh moved across scale spatially, for me, that movement happens through the articulation of questions that are multiscalar and multivocal, and that move between each other in different ways. And the new set of questions that I've begun to come to, because I came from the spatial but to inequality, is asking questions, particularly in COVID times, on questions of social security and social protection. What does it mean to make a dignified urban life? How does dignity return to the core? And I'm very interested in putting this together with a spatial perspective on the way I ask and practice. So I'm not just interested in whether we should have PDS or cash transfer or labor rights of certain kinds. I'm also interested in where social security spatializes, how it spatializes in different kinds of ways. Yeah. So the longer loop of my research, and I think this is the first provocation I want to give to you, is that there are some questions you keep asking in different ways for a very long time. Those are not questions that in my practice, I expect an immediate action from, immediate answer from. I ask them in order to understand. I don't always ask them in order to act. And I think that distinction is really important, because I think it's important to have questions whose temporality is not limited to projects. I think it's very important to keep having questions that you ask in every project you do, every year that you work, and watch how those questions change. So in terms of outputs, for me, the first work on evictions became a set of two books that, the same book in two languages, that documented the impact of an eviction on the banks of the Yamuna in Delhi in the early 2000s. And that urgency of that book for me was to give testimony. I wanted an empirical, authoritative way to understand the impact of evictions. But the doctoral work became something that became another book that was separate for me because it moved me from the question just of the eviction to questions of inequality, to questions of citizenship. And you'll see that move in the title, that centering of public interest. And a new piece of work that I was part of recently is an edited volume thinking about how does the practice of planning change when we think about planning in the South. And in many ways for me, the different parts of questions that I'm asking at different points crystallize into outputs that are the longer loop of research as a mode of practice, and where I keep trying to open up, not trying to close, but trying to be uncertain, trying to provoke, trying to think through. And this recent piece that I wrote on Notes on a Southern Urban Practice, its provocation is to think of a vocabulary of practice that comes from our city. So I propose 3 terms. The first is squatting as a technique of spatial design and production. The second is repair, and the third is to consolidate. And in many ways, I see many Sarosh's projects, particularly the Lima projects, and I can see squat, repair, consolidate exactly in them in certain kinds of ways, right? So I think that, if I think about this longer loop of research that is modes of practice structured about longer questions, the second is to think a little bit about, I want to show you this one project which combines a little bit of similar kind of correspondence to Lima. I added it when I saw that. This is work in a resettlement colony in Northeast Delhi that actually says, if people build incrementally over time, what is the move? What do they actually build? Why do they build when they build? Why do some people build slowly and some people build fast? Why do they build with the materials that they build? What is the knowledge behind this building? What is the expertise? Where is design here? Where is architectural practice? So you see here a really interesting cheat from what you would call a technical drawing, a measure drawing. But of course, I can't historically recreate a measure drawing, but I did. Because for me here, the method is as much an artifact. For the set of us who wrote this piece of work, we took long oral history narratives, borrowing from anthropology, but redrew those narratives as measure drawings, as if we were there at each part of these 11 years of building. Right? And if you look at a set of 20 houses, the black dot represents a year in which people built and the others don't. You look at the different patterns of incrementality, the nature of this. This is that long loop research, which keeps adding layers to our knowledge and ways of looking at things. But there's also shorter loop research, which is a different mode of practice, where you pick proximate battles, where the question of the urgency to act becomes central. And I think if you ask questions about inequality, you have to take seriously the imperative to act. I don't, at least from my practice, have struggled to feel content with diagnosis alone. But I believe diagnosis is essential in that longer research loop. So in the shorter research loop, we look at reports that are public access, that create work and say, what is the story of occupied land in Delhi? You create a map of informal settlements by physically visiting 700 of them in teams, mapping their borders, creating this archive so that you can get to this one point. Just look at the second last row, that Delhi's 757 recognized informal settlements cover only 0.6% of the city's land. Right? You take a contrast, if you take all the cars in Delhi and just look at the space under them, they cover 4% of city's land. 3 to 4% of city's land under cars, 0.6% in all our informal settlements. You start writing about more directed work, like a program that imagines a manifest for policy. All of these come from the same questions, but they're different modes of practice. They're different kinds of research. They're motivated by different starting points and end points, and they then take different forms in which they travel and circulate. And some of them come together. The question on the paper that I'm showing you now on the intent to reside is a question that takes on the cutoff date that dominates and determines in law if your incrementally built house is destroyed in an eviction, are you entitled to resettlement? Well, actually it depends on how long you've been there. And that notion of residence becomes a key spatial but political category that you zone in on and say, how do we determine who has the right to compensation, to remain, to not be evicted? How does this notion of temporality play out in this idea of a shifting cutoff date that, remember, the state decides? Another way to think about a mode of practice that is still within research is that it's research not done only within the university, within the academy, but research as a collective public practice. And this is something that has been core to the way I was brought and taught by mentors and activists in my early 20s. I was part of many social movements. And the way that I was trained to think of research as a collective political act. So 2 examples only here. I'm currently part of a very large citywide campaign in Delhi called the Maybe Delhi campaign. Delhi is building its next 20-year master plan. And what the campaign does is bring together organizations of informal workers to give technical reports that can speak the language of the plan, but come from worker perspectives on waste pickers, on street vendors. How do you put street vending into the plan? How do you put livelihoods into the plan? How do you put home-based workers into the plan? What do you do with rehabilitation? How do you put gender and transport into the plan? And so a series of reports that are collectively produced in a campaign format, but are absolutely both research and also a relationship to a practice of generation of knowledge about spatial practices. A similar one, the woman you see on the mic speaking is the head of one of the largest urban domestic workers union in Jaipur called the Rajasthan Gharelu Kamgar Sanstha and the RMKU. And we've been working for a long time with the union for the last 2 years, understanding various parts about informal work in urbanism. And we co-produced that research with the union. So when we went in, we wanted to understand how do domestic workers who don't have maternity leave because they're informal workers, how do they breastfeed? How do they manage to breastfeed without that formal entitlement? And the fact that they work in other people's homes, how do they spatially negotiate that? And then the union turned back to us and said, this is a great study. The next study we want to do, we will commission from you. And said, we want to understand rental housing and domestic work, right? And so the next study we started looking at is what are the spatial rental housing arrangements of domestic work, with a very interesting understanding that domestic workers typically walk to multiple homes in a single day. So therefore their patterns of housing location are deeply determined to their mobility, their identities, their patterns of work, and the way they move, right? The last one, for example, is the Delhi Housing Rights Task Force. That continues to both fight legal cases in court against evictions, that protests on the street against evictions, that organizes residents, that writes research reports, that documents evictions. So the continuing set of questions at different scales. It's not like you move from a policy type question and then suddenly only work for a couple of years on an abstract theoretical question. They're constantly part of different ways of articulating your everyday practice as someone who considers knowledge as a viable practice to influence the built form and considers it equivalent as a practice, as a verb, as to design or to build or to construct. The other one is to think about public writing as a practice that I believe is very much key to thinking about the conditions of possibility where certain things happen. So why is it that at some point we can think about regularization, upgrading of housing, but in other cases, we are unable to see in any ways the only model of housing we have is vertical redevelopment like a Bombay SRA model. Why do certain ideas become hegemonic at a certain period of time, become what Gramsci would call a common sense, so naturalized, so internalized that we don't even recognize there are other ways of thinking about this? To me, one of the things as urban practitioners we must do is we must be able to create the space for the ideas for our practices to follow. We must create a political, discursive language, imagination, thought piece for then the practices to follow. We can't say that the political will or the political imagination at one moment is X or Y. Political space has to be created. Right? So Foucault used to say that you have to create the field in which your ideas can take root. I'm paraphrasing very poorly. But so for me, public writing is another key mode of practice. I'm showing you 2 pieces that I wrote post-COVID, both in the Economic Times, both of which were about propositions on social security, migrant workers, and housing. Right? And the point of writing in this mode is not just say, to speak in a different register as an academic. To me, it's exactly the same work as research, because it's creating the possibility that certain ideas, certain arguments can suddenly become thinkable. Right? So sites and services, to take Sarosh's example, darling child of the 80s, horrible mistake of the 90s, ignored in the 2000s and back into favor in the 2010s. Ideas also, so Toni Morrison would say, you have to create, there are no new ideas that are waiting in the world to save us, or reload, right? There are no new ideas waiting in the wings to save us. There are only older ideas that we dare to keep dreaming again and again. And I really believe in this notion of a mode of knowledge generation that creates the possibility, and it creates a new imagination that practices follow. And sometimes that takes you to very unexpected places where you end up, doing TED Talks that you never thought you would, because you believe in creating the space for that idea. Right? And I think what's really interesting is across these different modes, you're not saying different things. You're saying things in different ways, but you're not saying different things. You're actually still answering the same set of questions that you're both chasing in the long durée and translating into short action. The other way then is, and increasingly for me more recently, is that I've had the opportunity to get my hands dirty into the implementation of many of these ideas. I think this is something, so I'm giving you 4 examples. When COVID happened, I was asked by the Delhi government to be an advisory member of a panel on emergency food relief, and thinking about the image you see, about e-coupons, about how do you get food to those folks who don't have ration cards? How do you deliver it? What's the system? I was part of working with many state governments because a lot of my practice is actually about the implementation of public programs and really seeing them through in certain ways. So the Odisha Land Rights Program that gives land and property rights to what the term used in the law is slum dwellers in small towns. Or working with the government of Karnataka to frame the affordable housing policy, in which we put a definition of residence that came from the intent to reside paper that we had written in the long durée research. And I want to keep emphasizing the connections between these slides, even though PowerPoint will make me go linearly. And really, at the end, what I want to say, and I really want to emphasize, because I think a lot of people forget this, and we talked about this yesterday, to me, one of my fundamental practices is teaching. Teaching to me feels very similar precisely to public advocacy, to activism. I think of teaching as a deeply political space. I think of it as a fundamental practice that both prepares practitioners and makes practice possible and opens up those kinds of imaginations. And I think not enough of us think of teaching as a fundamental spatial urban practice. Not all spatial practices are about the literal building of space, right? I think that's a key part of that materiality. But there are many ways to be a practitioner, trained spatially, trained as an architect, trained as a planner. There are many modes of practice that come from that. And I keep making the distinction between practice and profession precisely for this reason. And so, my teaching home is a place called the IHS, the Indian Institute of Human Settlements in Bangalore. We teach a year-long Urban Fellows program. For me, the questions we were talking about yesterday have been a core to us. For many years, we've been designing a new curriculum in what we call the Masters of Urban Practice, which is a deeply interdisciplinary way to think about the urban, all with its challenges and promises. But as a snapshot, our current batch of 36 students, between them has 26 different undergraduate degrees, ranging from film studies to architecture, to economics, to geography, to planning. What does it mean to think of the urban and curriculum with that kind of a diversity and that kind of a class? But I think it's equally important you go back to the question of research in collective political processes. We equally teach outside the university. This is an image from a series of courses we've done over a number of years with communities on understanding planning, the technicality of planning. This is in Indore. And the reason we do this is because when communities fight eviction, they need to be technically solid as they are on constitutional rights, as solid as they are on political negotiation. They also have to counter technical arguments levied against them. When people say, actually, you're on the right of way, actually, you're not in the right zoning category, the ability to counter those claims is a critical spatial practice that we think through. And you can see how one begins to intuitively work through constructing the logics of zoning in a different knowledge register. And one of the interesting things about these workshops is many of them are taught by faculty at IHS who are activists themselves. So we have several full-time housing rights activists who are fellows of practice at IHS, and they teach both embedded from these communities. They are themselves not academic PhDs, not full-time practitioners, they're residents and activists. And they teach our own students, they are jury for our studios, and they, because of them and with them, we're able to also teach outside the university, not just for communities, but of course, also with spaces of power. Because the other thing I think that's really important is that spaces and struggles for justice and inequality cannot just happen with communities. They also have to happen where we start working with and pushing people who hold power. So very often we will do series of works in low-income informal settlements, but we'll never do our spatial project in a gated apartment complex because they will shut the door on your face and not let you do any interviews and not talk to them. So we study the chawl, and we study the basti, and we study the informal settlement again and again and again, because power resists scrutiny. And therefore it is important to take on that challenge. And so a lot of the place where we teach, where I teach, is at the Lal Bahadur Shastri of National of Administration in Mussoorie, where all the IAS officers you'll ever meet in your life have to mandatorily go through their careers. And we teach probationers and people who've just cleared UPSC. And we also teach phase 5 officers who are, 35 years in service. And those are tough classrooms. But this range of teaching in its different modalities, I think works, is to me a practice that, again, you will see the echoes. It's the same set of questions, but they are being taken on in different modalities of practice, right? And remember, I'm describing 20 years of work. So it's not like all of them happen at the same time. And that's where I want to end. And, one of the things that I wanted to sort of suggest to you as you think about your practices is to begin and ask and say, what are your questions? I think that without that moment, without that step, we can become too opportunistic about being driven by the projects we get. Again, like we said yesterday, one can't be naive about the very real strictures that where people and that we face in our lives about building our own professional careers. But I think that there is a way in which, without naivety, one can still push. And I think our job is to push. And I think holding on to your questions is one of the things you remember what you're pushing for. The second thing is to think about your modes of practice. So I told you, for me, long loop research, short loop research, direct engagement, implementation, public writing, teaching, and collective research in collective and political spaces. Those are my modes of practice. Those are where I put my time and energy, and I keep trying to find ways to engage with them. And in my early 20s, I tried to get in wherever I could. And as I become more senior in my career, I can create those opportunities. They happen over time in many kinds of ways. The opportunities will not come immediately. But I think from my own experience, what I can say is that if we aren't trying to make them, they may not come at all. Right? And I think that's the thing we owe ourselves. And no matter where you are in this cycle, in complete control of what you can do, or with very little control and bosses who decide all you do, there are always degrees of freedom. It's that same incrementalism that we talk about. So can we push for just one more degree of freedom? And freedom to what? Freedom for what? For your questions, for your modes of practice. And that's why that loop keeps closing. And I think the hardest thing to do in this is to be able to hold on to both empathy and rigor in our positions. I have seen, I think, and we all struggle with this, where there is deep belief, deep passion, deep empathy, but very little rigor. Or deep rigor, deep technical skill, but almost a coldness that forgets why that work is being done. I think that simultaneity of empathy and rigor, I borrowed this framing from a historian friend of mine, Mario De Pena, and ever since he said it to me, it has remained something that I tell all the learners that are with me in my classrooms. And if you think about this notion of empathy and rigor, I think it becomes a both normative way to guide your practice. And the last thing I'll say is that it takes a while. It just does. You're not going to figure out at any given point clearly a neat alignment with your question, your mode, and the actual opportunity that you have. Right? The point is that struggle. The good news is you're never done figuring it out. I'm not done figuring it out. I can guarantee you Sarosh is not done figuring it out, which means that you can also stop trying to figure all of it out. I think like people who are auto-constructing and self-building incremental housing in Lima and in Delhi, we have to make the next move. And I think that a move that is guided by those set of questions, that is held to both standards of empathy and rigor, there are many practices that can be deeply spatial, that come from the training that you've got as architects, that expand the range of verbs available to you. And I would ask yourself what they are. And I would keep asking yourself once in a while, where am I with my questions and what are my questions today? And that's my time, so I'll stop.
Thank you, Gautam, for sharing your work. I invite Sarosh to rejoin us. We'll now begin our discussion and question and answer session. I request the audience to ask questions in the question and answer tab of your Zoom window and to mention the panelist for which question is addressed to. When somebody's question gets selected, we will turn on your video and audio. Do make sure to upvote a question and you would like to be asked. So Ahana can start with the first question.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking my question up. I can't seem to read my question again. Sanjana, is it possible?
I'll read it out for you.
Yes.
Okay, so Ahana's asked that the idea of vernacular has often been perceived in today's world through two extremely contrasting realms, more so than ever in relation to its economic value, a lot of which has to do with its aesthetic qualities, either as something which is elitist and highly exclusive in an attempt to recreate certain traditional environments, or as something which is rural, more primitive and messy. How can we then come in as an agency to incorporate its deeper value into the designing in order to create spaces which allow for an in-between, breaking free from these economic constraints?
Thank you, Malika. Yes. This question, I would like to add something to it. So while the talk was going on, I also kind of just as a thing, I kind of looked up the etymology of the word vernacular and its literal meaning. And there are two things that popped up. One is the language or dialect spoken by the ordinary people. And the other is architecture concerned with the domestic and the functional rather than public or monumental. So my question also intertwines into this question that why or how did we go from something that was to be perceived as domestic and functional into something that is now, you know, connected to economic constraints, and how can we as architects or as agencies kind of address this in practice?
Would you like to start answering that?
Either one. Do you want to take it, Gautam?
I'll catch my breath and
okay. Thank you for the question. It's absolutely pertinent. I think that first of all, one must understand that these constructs are only these terms are only as good as what we make of them, right? So if you look historically, the primitive hut, for example, you can think of it as the vernacular, but it has always been, you know, Loger has always thought of the primitive hut as the starting point for a lot of architecture. And one can argue also that the Greek temple can come from the primitive hut, completely the other end of the spectrum. And so vernaculars have had a great deal of migration, and one must be acutely aware of that so that one can absorb from them, take from them without this either formal or process-driven fear that there is something that, you know, you're kind of venturing into another territory. No, they've always been process-driven. They've always been layered ideas that have accrued over time. And so the vernacular, I would argue, is also practice. It is not something that was out there, that is historical, that is too sacred to be violated somehow. But the vernacular has been a process by which a typology, for example, comes into being, right? So I would not think of it as a kind of a priori concept, but really as a kind of construct also of time. The other thing I would say is that I think some of the most interesting work is oftentimes when the vernacular is implicated, used within architectural constructs without the kind of fetishization of the vernacular. So absorbing the things that work with the vernacular, the politics, the sociologies of the vernacular that are important to us, but without the kind of fetishization of it, the kind of, we have some sort of lost history that we have to go back to, this idea of like moving back to get something that had some fundamental truth that we have now lost. I don't prescribe to that. I much more think of it as a practice that has value, and one that from which one can freely absorb, learn, even appropriate, without a kind of stigma of any sort, right?
And I think that's a very nice framing of thinking about the vernacular as a process as opposed to an adjective, right? It changes its function in that way. And I'm always very curious to think about who is interested in calling something vernacular.
Absolutely.
And what is at stake in that? It's a very loaded thing to do. I mean, we all went to school where the shorter vernacular in elite upper-caste urban Indian space, vern is an insult, right? It is and you remember that the idea of the dehat is also a spatial understanding, right? And there's a lot of, so I think it's very interesting not just to think about what is the vernacular and what can it be. And I think I really like Sarosh's idea of taking it back as a space of generative possibilities. You're not freezing it in time. But I also think it's important to ask the power question of saying, why do we want to call certain materials vernacular? Why do certain building codes come that? And I find it very interesting to say that the modern never calls itself modern. It only calls other things vernacular. Right? So it defines itself by that negation. And that's an act of power. That's exactly what, if you think epistemologically, the modern that we know right now is very deeply a modern of enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. That's kind of the overhanging modernity we have, right? And I think what's very interesting in many ways, and for us, we receive it intersected and mediated through the colonial, because you can't do modern here without that. So, so interesting for me here, every time a word like this comes up, I'm always interested in who's using it as a label for what. And what are you trying to do? So many people use the vernacular to devalue or to reduce value in certain ways. So I think it is important for us to think about the act of using that term as a way of producing low value, not to describe something that has a certain economic value. So it goes back to another kind of productivity. And then it sort of frees you and says, what if we stopped ourselves from any adjectives? Then materials are materials. Right? And so I think, and even the revalorization. I mean, Sanjay Prakash, whose work many of you will know, who I've worked with very closely in some places, goes to Shanghai for the World Expo and builds this gigantic structureless bamboo pavilion, making a case about bamboo, right? But never says, I'm defending the vernacular. He's like, I'm using a future material, here it is. Never uses the word because he refuses to be caught into that language game. Right? So I think it's really interesting for us it's a very good thought exercise sometimes to not allow ourselves to use the words that we're familiar with and see what we are forced to then say. And that will tell you what that word is doing actually also in kind of repeating certain patterns of knowledge. The other brief thing I'll say is, I think the big challenge to the dominance of Enlightenment and industrial modernity actually is the ecological Anthropocene. So I think that industrial modernity cannot translate into the Anthropocene. So it's a very good time to not just chuck out that idea of the modern, but to chuck the vernacular, colonial vernacular it got with it as well. So I would say dump the term. Let's change the question. It's David Harvey used to say that the counter-revolutionary idea is that which prevents you from asking the real question. So I think that's the way I would approach it.
I think next we have Anindya.
Hi, so my question was, to work with such issues such as rehabilitation, it's just an example here. One opens up a platform that is usually to negotiate and are temporary, even the platforms provided by the government. For that matter, how does one as a designer help in forming a more permanent and a platform where it's more it's not just negotiation but deliberation?
It's a very tough call in India. This is, it goes back to something we were saying yesterday. There is no way to wish away the structural power imbalance in what is called participating with the government. And I say this as someone who has fought against a government's participation program and tried to run one as the government and kind of got beaten up in different ways in both cases. And it goes back, I think, to my sense of saying, yesterday we were saying, what does successful participation look like? And I want to ask this question because sometimes when projects are shut down, we think of that as the failure of participation. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I think a very successful participatory process can result in a project being stopped, right? Because people participated and their participation was dissent. So the thing is, participation has become very tamed into, and planning particularly had that whole history in the middle of collaborative planning based on a Habermasian notion of public reason. We can keep negotiating and find this middle ground. And then actually one of the urban theory things, there was a South African urbanist called Vanessa Watson. And she said, what is collaboration within what she called deep difference? And she was talking about post-apartheid South Africa. And she said, is there a point where the difference in inequality is so vast that participation is actually co-option? This debate is still on, I think, in many ways. And one of the very simple things that when I was thinking of government projects and rehabilitation projects is ask yourself if the project has a no-build option as a possible outcome of participation. Because very often when government projects go into participation, the option not to do the project is not a valid outcome of that participation. And the minute it's a valid outcome, actually the whole game changes, right? Because actually you acknowledge that you're going in with something. That's one trick I would offer you. Can we think of a participatory process where stopping the project is not considered failure, but a genuine participatory process? And the ways in which to make that participatory are multiple. But the root of it to me, I mean, for my personal take, there is no shortcut to the long work of organizing, because the power imbalance is so real and it's a very different kind of practice. And I think, and it doesn't mean all of us have to be organizers, but it means all of us need to network and know organizers, support organizers, and think about how one engages in those ways. I think rehabilitation is a particular example where the notion of the community organization is particular. In other examples, there'd be a different set of ways. But how do we even that? How do we even the structure framing of in which participation is happening? I think in different places, sometimes you do it by changing the law. So when the new Land Acquisition Act came, village councils for rural land acquisition got more rights to say no. So the strategy there was not to empower communities. The strategy there was to change the legal framework itself. That's a long durée strategy. All of those strategies are ways of fighting this battle. No one is going to be effective without the other. A better law is necessary but not sufficient. Empowered communities are necessary but not sufficient. So the question I would ask you to ask yourself is your instinct and skill set and predilection to work with the law, which is fine, or is it to organize communities to fight that law, which is also fine? Both of them require the same analysis, but they lead to very different practices.
So for example,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just thinking, so another example is Sabarmati riverfront rehabilitation, where all the people who were going to get a rehabilitation did not get. In fact, if there were around 25,000 families, some of like 10,000 of them only they got it. And the rest of them, they opened up a platform where there was a negotiation where they had to prove their residency, and only then will they get a house in the rehabilitation. So in such cases, for example, in this case, they opened up a platform, but it was only till the proof or the case is there. And after the case is shut, the platform is shut to the people. There is no permanent platform for such people who want to again go to the same thing, because if they want to address something related to rehabilitation of Sabarmati, they will have to again form another platform. So that's
Absolutely.
what I'm asking.
And so now you've diagnosed the way participation is closed. Now start from there. Diagnose that closure. See the techniques that were used to shut off that resistance by a temporally limited thing. That diagnosis helps us to recognize when it happens elsewhere and begin to make new workarounds. So the beginning starts from saying, where was the closure here? Right? And when you begin to understand that closure, the next time we're in a project, we anticipate it. But it also means that that set of folks now starts new strategies. Do we go to court? Do we go to the street? Do we go? So the move in practice is you hit one wall, you try something else. You go to court, you get thrown out, you try something else, right? But it's also to remember and learn from what happened so that our fights keep getting better in new situations. What we should not happen is that the same kind of closure happens somewhere else, right? And we were not able to anticipate it because we didn't learn, we didn't diagnose, that knowledge didn't travel. So both of those things.
So I just want to add to this. I think that urban planning has become, as was said, for many things, urban planning, I would argue, is too important to be left to the planners alone, right? So planning is too important to be left alone to planners. And I think that in this case, we as architects have to, and citizens, have to be much more embroiled within the processes by which large commissions happen. Especially the questions of scale are critical to questions of participation, right? So when you are doing something at the scale of Sabarmati riverfront or a mass rapid transit system, immediately there are consolidations of power. So it becomes the negotiations are inevitably skewed, and you are inevitably negotiating from a compromise position. And I think that this is really the bane of our problems here, that we are in most of the cases negotiating from compromise positions. And how do you not negotiate from compromise positions? One of the things, as Gautam alluded to, is if even the possibility exists of a project not to be done, right? And I couldn't say this enough, but I think that in the future, architecture might entail very much doing less or doing not doing new projects, but working from within instead of working like from above, right? So not the plan view, but other views of engaging with material and practice. And one other thing, I think that one should always understand that you're never not a citizen. You're always a citizen. So I don't see these as disciplinary confines. That with the riverfront, there were just ethical questions that had to be addressed, and anyone interested in questions of the city would have to engage with questions of ethics, right? So I think that questions of ethics have to be woven into questions of practice. And then the last thing I'll say is that there was a time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s where there was such a thing as an architect that would work for the city, work for the government. The idea of a kind of socialist project that the state had was very real, and we have completely lost that. And I would argue that space, to go back to Toni Morrison and the fact that ideas never go away, they just get dormant, that space needs to be reconstructed somehow. Because again, at the risk of being shot at, I'll say this, that planning is too important to be left, or, the city is too important to be left to planners alone. And architects have traditionally for the past 30, 40 years being losing that kind of place. And I think we bring a different sort of value and sensibility to questions of urbanism that are outside of, logistics and bureaucracies and tables and numbers, which are important, but they are not, the only means by which imaginations are constructed. Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to drag it, but for this thing, the government has already, they have kind of opened up a platform which is like a ward for each city. So for the ward, you approach the people, you come up with your whatever proposal, and you go to the ward, and then again they go out to the commissioner, and the ward has engineers. That's where when you said that there are no architects or somebody from the other field in that particular jurisdiction or that particular jury where they decide if it should happen or not. So for this, again, what Gautam said about you will have to fight with either the court or on the road. So I think I am so I think there is no particular.
But there's another bigger crisis here, which is that why is it that when large vision plans are made for the city, Plan 2040, how many architects are involved in Plan 2040 for any city, and I think that these are problems because the idea of planning has been looked at in this kind of purely technocratic sense for far too long, and I think that has resulted in concentrations of power that do not allow for, to go back to your question of negotiation, where the participatory problem arises with large concentrations of power. And so as soon as you have that, you always end up being in the Mohalla committee, in the ward committee, but why are you not in the question of like the, planning at a kind of regional larger scale, which comes with its problems. But I think that the more participation one has at those levels, the more we are a democracy.
And in India, we're not going to be invited there. You'll have
right.
Exactly. That's what my next question was. Like, as an architect, how does one go to that circle and they insert themselves in such high power, whatever you want to call that circle, which is already concentrated with very, very important people? How do we insert ourselves into such situations? Because it cannot be done by being on road.
So
it can only
start from where you are. What can you do where you are? You can write, you can go to the site, you can protest, you can put other imaginations out there, you can join organizations, so take the moves that you can make from where you are, right? And don't discount them. And the other thing is, keep asking not just what do I have to do now, but keep asking the longer question of what happened here. Keep trying to understand what happened here, right? Because without building that, the ability to fight the next fight, it's not going to be the only one. The projects are going to keep coming. And we have to build that capacity out as well, right? So I think the question is, you look at the Central Vista project in Delhi. I find it really interesting. It's the largest, most public architect mobilization I've seen in a long time, right? And I'm both happy to see it, and I'm also like, where was everybody when the evictions were happening? It's like I'm both being snarky about it, but also being happy that they're here. And it is a new mode of engagement, and there are legal cases being filed, and people are doing various things. So I think moments will create opportunity, but we keep pushing, right? Both in the immediate and the long term. So think about what are the modes you have open to you right now. Don't think about the fact that I can't enter the high table. No one goes straight to the high table. None of us. So make the next move.
The other thing that I just to quickly add to this is that there are entire realms of practice that are visible, of struggle that are visible, but I think it is mind-boggling when one starts researching and finding out struggles that are or conditions that are utterly invisible, and decisions that are made which affect billions of people, you know, at what point did we all start eating just 2 types of chicken, right? Nobody asked me. And here we are. And so some of these decisions, right, the ways in which global capital flows, the ways in which large MNCs control larger and larger parts of everything you do. You know, everything I buy online makes Jeff Bezos richer now. Every single thing. I buy a toothbrush online and it makes Jeff Bezos richer, right? So I think that this idea of agency is really important to understand, that you are still an actor in the world, and I can decide not to buy this thing on Amazon, and perhaps then what other economies am I contributing to, right? So I think that this is where research, I think, is fundamental, because we need to understand how we are implicated in the world first and foremost before we can even begin to act.
Hi, I had a question. Sarosh, when you showed the plan wherein the fishing boats were shown, it really struck me how anthropocentric the world has become, also with the chicken example. And hence, in architectural realm as well, it is so intertwined with our design practice as well that it is almost impossible or unimaginable to see a different perspective, a non-anthropocentric perspective to design. And first question would be, do you think there is a need for one? Because I've been reading Donna Haraway's texts lately, and that has been informing what I am saying right now. So do you think there is a need from breaking these boundaries of Anthropocene? And if yes, then how can we do that at a scale of what an architect can do?
Right. Fantastic question, of course. I think that scales are things we have to learn to navigate, right? So this is something we are actually taught quite well in architecture school, to work across scales, from a door jamb to a building to a neighborhood to a city. But I think from beyond the city, we have to now talk about, you know, larger networks, flows of things, global north, south, planetary issues, and so forth. But I think that the most fundamental problem is not one of how do we act, but one of how do we construct a problem? How do we construct a worldview? How do we look at things? I think that, and this is something that Gautam also alluded to, the ways in which you construct your practice, your problem, will inevitably inform the ways in which you act. And just as a small example, you know, in Ahmedabad, in the old city poles, I was always fascinated with all these sculptures of birds and so on, but sometimes even in the plaster, there is a little hole for the parrot to sit. Think about that for a minute, right? I think that that's kind of beautiful, because how many buildings do you make when you make these niches in the plaster for birds to sit in? This is kind of, you know, not terribly ecological, because it doesn't tie up to, you know, all kinds of complex processes by which migration, food, foraging, all of those things happen. But the idea that something is represented, something is part of my problem, right? I have constructed, I'm building a house, and the parrot is very much integral to the ways in which I'm drawing diagrams. I have to draw a diagram to start now thinking. I have to start building this as site, as material, as context. And I feel that once you start doing that, once you start shifting your lens, you start seeing it across multiple scales, right? And I think that questions of the planetary first need to be visualized. This is where I think that the biggest questions are of representation, visualization, and also of action. But actions can be in multiple ways. You know, actions can be stitching alliances across territories. Actions are also about activism, research, writing. All of these things are and then increasingly for me, I have found a little bit of solace in the unbuilt work of architecture as provocation. I think that's a legitimate mode of practice, and it has always been for architects.
This question is above my pay grade, so I'm not going to answer it very well. But I will just one offering that what I find exciting about the Anthropocene. I think is actually the fact that I think it allows a different route to the question of value. And I think it allows a very different empirical route to the question of value, right? And I think that if there's one thing that can begin to challenge the kind of planetary urbanization that undergirded a GDP-centered industrial expansion, I think that the Anthropocene, you should also think of it as a financial provocation, not just a ecological, material, or human non-human interface. So just go out of left field. Think of it as a financial provocation. And I think that it'll help you unpack a bit of what Sarosh is talking about, of the structures of value and global capital that shape built form. In some places where they're cracking, I think this because there's an alternative way to think of valuation. So try a totally different archive. Try and think of it in terms of numbers and dollars and money. And it's very complex, right? Because you'll also hit carbon offset trading and Amazon displacement and compensatory forests. So we have to connect to Anindya's question about rehabilitation. We have a very interesting story right now in Delhi where they want to displace communities on the Yamuna river bank in order to build compensatory afforestation patches for places where they have cut trees to build the new okay? And that question of environment development, right? That question of trade-off, there are lots of layers in this that are very spatial. But I think that there's one way, this is the worst way of it, right? Where you actually pit environment and development against each other and find another way to break the back of the vulnerable. But there's also a possible retelling of it another way, which is the kind of valorization of slum upgrading as the best climate adaptation
Absolutely.
practice.
100%.
Very interesting set of ways. So I think the Anthropocene is a political arena that lots of people are trying to control the narrative, and there's a very interesting financial backbone to it. So I would try and find other traces of it also in your practice. I think it'll be very interesting.
And like the vernacular, the Anthropocene is also a very loaded question. Who defines it is a huge crisis and a huge problem, So I find it highly objectionable to use the term to implicate all of human beings. Why are all human beings on the same playing field? No, this guy in Las Vegas is consuming 5,000 liters of water a day, and somebody else somewhere in another part of the world is consuming 20 liters of water a day. Why are they both equally implicated in the Anthropocene? So the Anthropocene is the danger in using the word is the flattening that it causes politically and socially, which is highly problematic, and also somehow the impetus on it as a kind of climate change, ecological agenda, which divorces it from social problems. And I think this is where we need sociologists, extremely important in saying exactly that there are, there are modes of working this that absolutely have to at all times engage humans and not solve ecological problems, because the problems are human constructs. And I want to just very briefly talk about this book, one of the earliest books by Ramchandra Guha that really influenced me. I was very taken by it, but he talks about ecological movements in the United States and in India. And he says that the wilderness movement, John Muir, Henry David Thoreau, the wilderness movement in the US was something that existed as man against nature. So you take a natural reserve, you put a big giant fence around it, and you call it a national park, and you get out of there, right? And that is nature. Whereas in India, the construct of nature, and especially of conservation, can never be divorced from humans. And the Chipko movement is a very good example of that. right? Where you would never have saved the forest without the tribals, without the people hugging the forest. So I think that this construct is essential to us, that nature is not outside of human domain, but nature is human domain. And we have to be able to always construct linkages between the two.
Thanks a lot. That answers a lot of things and opens up a lot of doors as well.
We have a question by Jai on the idea of public spaces in the global south countries.
Yeah, so my question is, the idea of public spaces in global south is very unique than the European public spaces in terms of nature of involvement of community. Then what is the idea of public spaces in these countries according to you? And very specifically, if I say, what is Indianness in Indian public spaces is what we observe. But like the communities, its interrelationship, the adaptation of current public spaces, etc. But then how do we take the idea of the southern urban theory further in our design practices?
So, I mean, what I would say is, so I would be very wary of any category of Indianness of any kind. I think it's a way of asking the question. I think that will hide more than it reveals, because it will force you to kind of come to closure as opposed to opening. But I think the question you're asking is very interesting, right? So if you say, why are our public spaces different from Europe? Let's start there. Why is that? What's the difference? Is it our form? Is it our social relations? Is it particular kinds of who built our public space and when, right? So you think of, large colonial capital cities like Calcutta and Madras, and I'm using Madras because I'm calling it a colonial capital city, right? And you think about the particular ways in which space was organized in parts of those cities. You think of the settlements that ring Corbusier, Chandigarh, which no one ever talks about. When they talk about Chandigarh, it just sort of ends at the grid as if there's nothing built outside it, right? So if you think about, so I would turn around and sort of say, what is it that's in some ways, start from your own archive. So ask yourself, where do you feel like you're in public space in cities? Where do you go? Where do you relax? Where do you encounter strangers? Where do you meet other folks that are not kin and family and network? Where do you hide? And your own archive is a way to think about, is there difference in the publicness in our context? So is it because of the way the gullies are shaped, right? And the way the banyan tree is in the middle of it? Of course, part of it is spatial. But is it also because of the symbolic and meaning and control of who decides to who walk when? Is it shaped by my caste identity and my gender identity? 300,000%, right? So how do they all mix up together? So I would say, take Sarosh's point about the vernacular. Ask not where is public space. Let me find it, draw it, map it, put a polygon around it and say, this is public. Yeah. Ask when is public space? When is the space public? So what I find really interesting, Bangalore has a really fancy mall. Huh? And the mall is like, it's not the kind of like the standard mall. It's called Orion, of course, right? And it's like, it's got this whole thing. Inside, it's got a very classic, like big, like, like a pool kind of thing. It's a big glass building and fancy restaurants. But there is, that pool is home to, it's the equivalent in Delhi of the Lodi Garden working class dating site. Because you don't have to buy anything. And you can perform a certain aspiration being there. And the reason people use that space is because they feel protected by the layer of security. So for one person, publicness is created by a kind of closure. And there's two Palestinian architects called Alessandro Petti and Sandy Hilal. They run something called the DAR Collective, D, 2 A's and R, maybe Decolonizing Art and Architecture Residency. They tell a fantastic story of being commissioned to make a public space in a Palestinian refugee camp called Dehesha. So they build it, amphitheater, open on all sides, anyone can walk in, right? Think of this tight, dense form in which you have this open space. Nobody goes there. मतलब खुला है, बिल्कुल aesthetic, lovely है, सारा principles लगा दिया, it's plaza meets मैदान meets amphitheater, सब कुछ कर दिया, right? And you're sitting there, so why is no one going there? And they asked one of the women, why don't you go there? And she said to them, if I go there and get hit by a football, who is responsible for my injury? So she saw that radical openness as a sign of diminished solidarity. I feel lost in that space. So you know what they did? They built 2 walls and put a door. The exact opposite feeling of building a public space. When they put a door, everyone played football and had chai in that plaza. Why? Because they said, when you walk in through that door, you take responsibility for yourself, right? Just like that mall made a certain publicness possible while closing other forms of publicness. So if you turn the question and say, what are the practices by which we create a moment of publicness? So what's the moment of publicness? Good urban theory will tell you the public is the place where you meet, it's anonymity, it's encounter, it's flaneur, it's mobility, it's all of those things, right? And in many ways, I think that we have to say that maybe spatially it comes up in unexpected ways. So I'm interested in the practices of people that create moments of publicness rather than a space where I become public. The distinction I will make is, which I think is very interesting, is public infrastructure. Because I think public infrastructure has a kind of inherent way in which it can hold certain forms of interaction because of its function. So I've seen what the metro has done to Delhi and its quality of publicness, right? And I've seen there are many things, you know, I've seen what the distinction is between the bus system and the public system as mobility. So I think if we start layering it and start from maybe the archive you understand best, look at different urban built forms in India and say, in this place, where do you go have chai with someone you don't know? Where is that moment, right? And maybe it'll come in all kinds of spatial forms, different from when we intentionally try to create the plaza. And you know, in Bangalore, they lock the parks between 2 to 5 p.m. every day. The one city in India where you can sleep in the park at 3 in the afternoon, even in the peak of summer, you cannot. Why? Because they're afraid people will sleep in the park. So sleeping is an anti-public activity. Loitering is an anti-public activity. So my question is, where do people loiter and where do people sleep? So you can reverse back and say, in the Indian city, what is not public? Actually, because people work in public space, sleep in public space, move in public space, in India, everything is public until you gate it with force. You put a barrier and a guard and a glass. You actually have to constantly. So I, in a way, would turn around and say, to me, because most workers in India work in public space, all space is public until enclosed. So find the moments of closure. That's one way to think of it.
But at the same time, and I'm hoping you will agree with me, Gautam, that there is public space and there is public space, and the two are completely different constructs, in the sense that if I am a woman, if I am a domestic help, if I am of a certain caste, only some kind of public space is available to me, right? Absolutely. For my driver, another kind of public space is available to me than what I would consider Absolutely. My kind of public space. And here I think, so there are two things I want to tease out in your question, and I think that these are it's an important question in the kind of dangers that we again afford with the use of language and also with the construction of identities. And so I think Indianness, I don't know, I agree completely with Gautam in the sense that I'm really hard pressed to find an Indian public space. You know, it is like asking what is an Indian architecture, and we tried that, and it is you know, usually these things create an impoverishment, because it means that, you know, of the millions of different types of practices, people, identities, you know, it's like exactly like picking Hindi as the national language. You know, you're bound to commit all kinds of blunders as soon as you say Hindi is the national language. And do we need an Indianness? Are we so lost that we cannot have 50 different types of Indianness that constantly change, that are needed, that are diverse for different types of publics? And I think here I am interested in questions like the Sunday Bazaar, right? Because the Ravivari market, at least in Ahmedabad, and maybe there are certain kinds, very few, and I think this is for me very interesting. Like maybe the railway station back in the day. Nowadays, I think airports are killing it. But there are some weird, odd, strange moments, ubiquitous public spaces where the Dalit woman, your domestic help, the hawker, and then like in the Sunday market, there is the kind of odd professor who goes to find old books, you know, this kind of place where some sort of condensation can occur. Of course, there is the larger question that just because they're under one place, it doesn't mean that they're intersecting in any way, but at least it is worth considering what can happen there, right? It is at least worth asking, worth being aware of that, right? There are some public spaces where only some types of people go to, and perhaps that's okay. But there are other public spaces that are much more intersectional. And I think one can build up a sort of thickness of publicness, or a thickness of publics, right? Multiple different types of publics across a gradient of scales and types of spaces.
Yeah, I agree.
Can I just intervene? I just think it's really interesting, Gautam, that you use the word loitering, and then you specifically talked about malls to talk about public space. And if you were to refer to Shilpa Phadke's work and then tie in this whole argument, we start talking about how malls in themselves are so exclusionary, you know? So, like, I think it was interesting.
They are and they aren't, Malika. A mall in Ranchi is not the same thing as a mall in Bombay. I've seen malls in Ranchi. They are a very different circulation for a very different aspirational landscape as well. And I don't think Shilpa would disagree. I think that when you think about, right, when you think about the layers, every boundary includes and excludes. Every boundary protects some at the expense of others. So the layers of publicness are also constantly being cut and recut with each other. It is also true that the opening of coffee chains gave young urban Indians a place to be public with each other in a way that nothing else could. The parks couldn't do that to them, right? So the mall is a confusing space to me. I love to look at it and kill it. It is so easy to kill. But you think about the aspiration also of a lot of people for whom a mall is not just a simple space for exclusion. I think it's very easy for, I am an extraordinarily elite person in Indian society. For me, it's very easy to say, this mall is so exclusionary, right? But the mall doesn't represent a certain mobility to me that I also desperately want. So I think we have to challenge ourselves. I mean, I have been in that mall in Bangalore and I see who's there. And it's my students who challenged me in the project and came back. I asked the same question you did. And they came back to me and said, sorry, it's not so simple.
It is further complicated by the fact that we are architects and we are trained to see the mall with a certain kind of conceit, right? And that really further exacerbates the problem. And we haven't found architectures that marry the mall, the heart, and the bazaar in a way that makes sense to us from a formal aesthetic standpoint. So we come at it with a kind of added formal bias. And I think, Gautam, you're spot on in saying that we have to sort of peel back our formal biases and look at it as also a cultural condition without immediately ascribing our sensibilities onto it.
You can go to Delhi Heart for the same day, but you have to pay $50 to enter, right?
I was going to just, because you said hearts and malls, the first thing that came to my mind was Delhi Heart. That Delhi Heart is actually tougher to get into than a DLF promenade in a Delhi.
And it is totally fetishized. It's a completely fetishized construct of.
That's exactly my point. So I think it's complex. The idea is not to either kill the mall or save the mall. The idea is to realize that the public is constantly contested and being made and remade, right? And every boundary, but to also remember that one has to, so that's why I go back to the practices. See who sits there, see who uses it, right? So in Brazil, there is a practice called where young men and women from the peripheries, 300 of them together, go to a mall in the city center and just walk through it. Now, no one knows what to do because they're not doing anything wrong, but they scare everybody because they're not supposed to be there and they know it. But you can't call the police because they're just walking. And so what an interesting way the mall has been reappropriated as a size of enforced publicness and resistance, right? So I think it's important to also think, yesterday, some of the projects are talking about the distinction between the lived and the planned. It works both ways, right? So I just think that the layers of publicness are complex. A thing is not public or not public, right? There's a lot of complexity and layering in thinking about for whom and in what way. Just that.
We have Kashikar.
Yeah, hi
Kashi, good to see
Sarosh.
you.
Hi Gautam. So I was really fascinated by the nature of your practice, both Gautam and Sarosh. And since Gautam, you were talking of the distinction between the practice and the profession, which I think is extremely important. And Sarosh, you were talking also of the difference. I forgot which one of you were also talking of the difference between the practice and the project. That the practice is something much more than the project. So, and over the last few days, what the sense I get is that so many new facets have been unraveled in these discussions, that there is, in the mind of the student, there is a sense of helplessness, maybe, or being overwhelmed with the complexity that might somehow hinder action. And I just wanted to put one more thing into the mix, that I feel that a lot of times the practice is seen primarily as a job which will earn you money. Whereas something akin to, I mean, I hate that word corporate social responsibility, but something like a personal social responsibility, where you can leverage your education, but you're not seeing it as something that will give you money. As also, I mean, unpacking practice also as formed of these two components, so that it allows you to, on one hand also take care of your daily needs, but on the other hand also ask difficult questions. Because I've been thinking from a student's perspective that once you start asking these difficult questions, it becomes very difficult to take actions or build a project. Yeah.
No doubt. It's very hard. My mother used to call it paralysis by analysis. It is, I think that's, I mean, I struggle with this myself. I mean, we all do, right? It's not something that goes away. There is a very real political economy to economic survival and thriving. It is exacerbated in a very perverse way, because the more economically privileged you are, the more you are able to take risks. And so actually in many ways there is so it's not even just a differential, it's a very perverse differential that is part of the reproduction of inequality, right? So I can get away with a lot more. So I think for me, the unpaid internship is a classic example of this. Right? So you can only afford to do an unpaid internship if you are not poor. Like that's, I mean, it's this ridiculous kind of perversity, right? And I think that it's a very big struggle for that. So when I talk, all I can tell you is what I do when I talk to my learners is we try and do a kind of theater exercise where we say, take the constraints away and imagine your questions and your modes and your selves and your values just for a second. Okay? So give yourself a moment to unfiltered say, if I forget all the constraints, what is it that I value? Right? And once you get that, then bring real life back into it bit by bit and say, how much of this can I do now? How much of this can I do 5 years from now? What am I trying to get towards, right? So it doesn't take away the real inequalities of opportunity. I mean, and it is, you're right in there. I think that the difficulty can be of two kinds. I found that sometimes, that just that moment of realizing that this is what I'm trying to get, even if I don't get all of it now, it helps you to almost survive a job that is kind of taking your soul in some way, right? In a weird way. And we've all survived jobs that have taken our souls, right? I think I also try and remind many folks that it takes a bit. That's what I kept saying on the slide. It takes a while. We're not gonna get all of it, right, at the same time. But I think there's also a real important point about thinking about I do think that this current moment has more opportunities for younger folks. So we're talking about people here who got into college. Matlab, pahunch gaye. You know what I mean? So let's limit it to that for a second. So first thing is to recognize that you've already got more opportunity than just about everybody damn else, right? So it's, you know, so I also have there's only a certain amount of whining you're allowed about the difficulty of your life. There is an angst threshold. At some point you got to let it go, right? Because you're here, I get it, but you're here. So I think that there's a thing then to think a little bit about saying, I think that right now there are more possibilities to survive making a life in our cities doing a diverse kind of work than were ever true even 10 years ago. Right? I think there's no question about that. That openness has come. The difficulties don't go away, but I think right now the real question is if we can separate our practice as a project in the making, right, under construction, then even when you have to compromise on it for some periods of time, you can still hold on to your sense of self because you know that compromise is a compromise. Compromise is life. You know, there's no way to get away without it. But you know what you're looking for. I think to me, the anxiety that hurts a bit more is when you not only don't have what you want, you also don't know what you'd rather have than what you currently have. That one's a real pain because you don't even know what to be angry about. You're just vaguely dissatisfied. So I think that at that point, there's a nice moment to step back and say, let's do some work and say, what is it that I would do without constraint? And I feel like that exercise sometimes helps, but it takes time. It takes time to get to it. You've got to keep doing it and you got to keep experiencing things. And it falls, you know, Sarosh and I have told nice linear histories of our work as if we logically went from one project to the other. None of this happened. Yeah, you showed up somewhere, something happened, you found yourself somewhere on Wednesday and then something happened on Tuesday and then you went here, then you had one love affair, then, you know, that happened, then that year vanished, like life happened. So you can just keep trying to look for it. But I think also we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves. I think that the chase is to keep trying to find as much as you can what you value. And then you hold on to it. And then every 10 years you have a midlife crisis and you do it again. So that's the way it goes.
So I have a very different answer. And Kashi, thank you for always, you always kind of know the question to ask somehow. So thank you for the question. But I'm going to speak almost directly to the students here. And I think that it is a totally legitimate crisis. I don't want to graduate and work for a giant corporation. I know how I'm being used. I know how I'm being abused. And I would like to propose a few things that as professionals, we should shed immediately. One is this hagiographic construction in our profession, right? That there are all these mostly white men, Corbusier, Kahn, Mies, that we have to somehow modulate our lives. We have to somehow structure our lives to make projects that will somehow be comparable to that. I really urge you as students to abandon this idea totally and to instead say, how can you use your education to be real agent provocators, right? How can you push pins into balloons? How can you actually create things of value? And here, I really think, and someone said recently that unions and cooperatives will kill capitalism. And it hasn't happened, but I still, again, going back to the earlier point that you made, Gautam, about Toni Morrison, these are really strong tools. So I joined after years and years, I'm kind of mid-career in my life. I joined in New York. So imagine that you're an architect in New York. These problems are exacerbated. Your rent is $2,000. You need to earn $5,000. The only way you can do it is working for a shark. You don't want to do that. And so what are your choices? And I think these are, again, the way in which global capital works. These are problems that are recreated worldwide. So I really suggest that as students, you collectivize, you talk to people across schools, you create an organization or you create various organizations where these questions are asked iteratively again and again and again. What are the different kinds of practices that are legitimate, that are possible? You collaborate with others to create institutions or cooperatives of your own where you can undertake such projects, right? So I think that it needs a kind of radical reimagination of what project and practice entail in this time. Because if you want to add value, yes, working for, and I'm completely in agreement that I face this crisis myself every living day, even today. But from hindsight, if I had to sort of look at myself now and say, what should I have done differently when I was in my 20s? Yes, I should have been much more kind of cooperative, collaborative, and even activist in my manner and approach to problems at large. And there is no such thing as having, learned all the skills before you get to apply them. That's the other mistake we make, that we have to somehow join an office, work for like 10 years and understand how every single working drawing is made before we can start our firm. Most learning happens by doing it. So, I think, if you have to work for an office, maybe think about unions, because I think as architects, we again have this elitist notion that we are somehow, not workers. No, we are workers, because if you're a 100-people office and you are doing, working drawings or tiles or God knows what, and spending hours and hours doing it, you're a worker in a factory, and that gives you agency if you embrace a certain understanding of unionization. So I would suggest cooperatives and unions as fundamental values that we actually start working with. And I'm part of a union of such an organization in New York called the Architectural Lobby, and I would welcome conversation with any of you, all of you, for all kinds of cooperative, collaborative projects, thought projects and otherwise.
All right, thank you. We do have one question left. So do you think you would have the time to answer it?
Let's take one.
All right, so Garima can take the last question.
Hi, my question was for Dr. Bhan. It was about this idea of looking at housing as a verb or a process that you talked about, and how to integrate it in an otherwise formal design process where we always know that the expected result is a formally completed building. And even if we are thinking about incrementality, is strictly like a subtraction where we have already imagined what the whole building is going to be, and we show it diagrammatically, like this is how the building will look in the future, and we know all the permutations and combinations. So how to incorporate this idea of the layers of life and time that you were talking about into the design thinking and the process?
Just to add to what Garima just said, I was quite intrigued by what you said, Gautam, about the phenomena of housing, but not houses, and which includes life, partial, financial, legal, lot of aspects. So just to add to what Garima asked, like, how do we actually break the notion of formal and physical housing and involve all the other processes in it, as designers, particularly?
Sarosh, do you want to respond first? Because many of your projects gave a design process for incrementality, I thought very nicely in a way. I was very intrigued by it. Do you want to take that on first?
No, I don't think the formal is something to be resisted or to be negated. I think that as architects, we embrace form. This is what we do. And it's not a bad word. So I think that the question is, how do we imbue form with agency? How do we problematize form? How does form relate to structures of finance, right? And so if you start thinking of form as something that, when you conceive of a form, it has the capacity for aggregation, it has the capacity for incremental thinking, it has the capacity to do various things, to be open-ended. Again, we are not taught that very well, right? We are not taught to make 10 models of a building and say all 10 are legitimate. I stand and in a review, people will go crazy. They're like, no, what's your project? It's like, it's all 10 of them. But we are not allowed to do that. And I think that if you construct an argument around it, you are allowed to do that, even within the confines of disciplinary practice. And I think this is the whole point of at least my talk, is that architecture is both formal and social, right? We have to find and problematize and really make these connections, because otherwise we always privilege one over the other, and then the disparity is oftentimes pointed to as a kind of quote unquote failure of architecture. Whereas I think that these things are much more complex. You know, the biggest myth in this is like Pruitt ego. So Pruitt ego is used, you know, Pruitt ego, the famous housing scheme in that has been used time and time again. Those images of like the explosion are used as symbols or like as signs of like architecture's failure. You know, as architects, you guys failed at your responsibility for social provisions. And this is really a conspiracy. I mean, if you look it up, it really is a conspiracy, because what failed was the collapse of socialism, and you got neoliberalism. These housing schemes were not funded. There was no water. These things were, you know, there were layers of crime because there was no intersectionality of the kinds of people living there. You know, the problem was much more complex than one of long corridors and a certain appearance of form. So I think that if as formalists, because we are all trained as formalists, we have to find ways by which we can engage, imbue, and address social questions that are not rooted only in one. That's why a one-time solution isn't good enough, because we have to sort of ask questions that are of process, of verb form, and not only noun form.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, and so first is I have to cite correctly. Housing as a verb and a process, 1972, John Turner, really, you know, good
right.
work. I mean, please don't attribute it to me. It would be a very disservice. But I mean, many people have said it in different ways, but he was one of the first folks who did it. I mean, of course, people were Latin American urbanists were writing about it in Spanish even before then, because it was such the dominant condition of the way housing was being built, right? But in English, it came to us via Turner in the 70s. I think that one of the things to think a little bit about is, one is that if you take away the idea of the formal design process and instead say, how can I engage with it? Then the question changes a little bit. Right? So you may not be able to engage with it in a formal design project in the way formal design is currently practiced. It may not allow you that opportunity, which means you have to look elsewhere for the opportunity. The good news is you live in a southern city, you are surrounded by ongoing incremental building and housing all the time. So that engagement can take many different forms, right? So there are certainly ways in which the formal world of practice is structured that closes certain opportunities, right? And therefore we look elsewhere for those engagements. So one way to think about it is, what if you entered incrementality, thinking about repair practices, upgrading materials? So one of the best discussions housing rights activists had in the late 1980s, there was a national campaign to try and get a right to housing declared in India. And they got very far. It's one of those interesting historical stories, because they were even drafting a bill. They had a supported government. Some of the senior chief Supreme Court justices, like, you know, Justice Potipati and Krishna Iyer, were involved in drafting. And it was the first time that unions had gotten together with housing organizations, with party organizations. First time housing labor work had come together. It's a powerful campaign, right? Which kind of lost its way because Rajiv Gandhi got assassinated. Speaking of geo-historical complex systems, right? It just derailed everything as the politics changed. But one of the things they had under the right to housing was about supply chains of construction material. Because they recognized that the fundamental point about housing in India was this continuous need for innovative and low-cost material supply. That's one way to start studying incrementality, even without a formal design project, right? It's to start thinking about looking at repair very closely is another way to do it, not in the context of heritage and conservation, but say, why can't I take this repair studio not in heritage and conservation and take it instead in informal built environment, right? So one of the things to think about it in a different way then is to also say so in some ways, incremental housing may not be something you as a practitioner can initiate in a formal design process. So it represents the limit currently of the professional practice. Accept that limit and find other ways to engage. And maybe that limit will shift and the practice will shift and experimental projects will come up, and they will, because, you know, Sarosh has got some of them, and you'll get an opportunity to think of frames that can build up like that image he showed, which could go either way, right? And I think the other thing is to then see unlikely places where incrementality gets stuck. For example, the National Building Code. The National Building Code did create a chapter called Informal Housing Building Code. It's a really interesting document. It's got all kinds of imagination of what if the minimum standards for space, health, safety, whatever, were to be reached in a certain time, but not to be reached immediately at construction. Look at that really small move in the way the building code works. The minute it says, we give you 5 years to get to safety standards. So I was saying, I'm not going to compromise on your safety, but I recognize that incremental housing reaches norms differently than completed housing. So sometimes the way to enter and engage from your practice is with the National Building Code. It's with the definitions in the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana and Housing for All that only allows vertical redevelopment, but not incremental expansion. So there are always sites to engage with the processes that you're interested in. They may not come as fully formed projects. And then Kashika's question is really right. It may not be the job part of your activity. It may be the practice part of your activity, and start there. And then look for that opportunity that suddenly shows up. But I mean, I don't know enough about the profession, but I have seen some examples around me where there are more formal projects that can actually take that form seriously. And I think that they exist. But I'm saying, to me, Sarosh will tell you about those. But as someone who doesn't know that practice, I'm saying that I, as a non-architect, find endless opportunities to engage with incremental and process-based and time-based housing. It's just not informal design. So if that's an option for you, consider it. Try another way to be a designer and an architect then within that process in some ways. And I think, Sanjana, to your question, I think the move between house and housing is, I think it's really important, because it is the way you take an abstract concept you read in an academic class and then challenge yourself to translate it and say, but in practice, this means I have to speak at the level of the settlement, because now I'm talking about sanitation and infrastructure as fundamental to housing. I have to talk about it in terms of, and the reason why we came to housing, not houses, which is something we say a lot, is because informal housing environments are never individually built. See, if you have to occupy some land and cut it out yourself and then fight for Bijli and negotiate with an MLA and fight the police off, context eviction, what do? You have to do it collectively. Unlike individualized house, where I rent it, I buy it, I build it, it's only about me, right? I negotiate with my neighbors or whatever. But actually, incremental housing is not just temporally procedural. It is also fundamentally socially collective. Right? Because there's no one giving you your plot. So it's also interesting, it's a fundamentally public process. And that change, in one way, if the process of building a built environment is collective, then it can never be the individual house that is your unit of analysis. Because the individual house was never the unit, that golden ratio unit. It's not the repeating motif of how it was built. 5 people had to decide how much space to put and set and how much thing to leave. And so one very interesting project is when you look at auto-constructed informal settlements and realize that there are organic developmental control norms and setbacks and light safety regulations and practices that have been worked out, right? And they've been negotiated and created. So I think if you were to give yourself even a thought experiment and say, if I got the chance to do a new low-income housing project, how much would I build and hold and how much would I leave? Because again, you go back to something saying it's not to diminish the importance of either a formal design process or a form. Form is required. Infrastructure is required. Scaffolding is required. Real material support is required. But can it enter in a way that respects this collectiveness? And the minute you say, I'm here to build housing, not build houses, you may spend your entire time retraining yourself to become an engineer, because the real thing is about underground drainage pipes. And if that's the material environment that pushes self-built housing, then that's what you should build. Right? So I think there's many ways to enter this, but some of them are quite transversal and counterintuitive.
My only 2 cents would be just know your own histories a little more. So, you know, there is huge histories to architects doing incremental housing. It's vast. from South America to South Africa to India. India's our most canonical projects are incremental housing, Aranya by Doshi and Belapur by Korea. So, you know, if you look at your own histories, you will see that actually this is a very old idea. And like all old ideas, it has been used, abandoned, but also built upon. And I think that we have to find new ways of actually channeling current current forces, right? So ways of finance, ways of you know, how is this valid and current now? And it is. But I think that just historically, there is a lot of history to it in not only John F.C. Turner, but also the way in which the idea of incremental housing has moved across Africa and India now. And in India, it's been around since the 80s easily, maybe before that.
Malka, you're muted.
You're still muted.
Yes. So thank you. This has been very interesting. I think it was really, really interesting that one of you presented about policy and one of you presented about practice. And in the real world, there's such a large gap across streams in our country, especially. So I think it's brought out really interesting things for the discussion. I would really like to thank both of our panelists today for joining us and inciting such thought-provoking and interesting discussions. We are sure these conversations are going to stay with us and help us think about our practices and our future more critically. I would also like to thank everyone on behalf of the KVDF team for joining us today on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. Do join us tomorrow from 7 p.m. onwards for our curated discussion on our third sub-theme, human nature. And stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.